Today, it's great to have Jud Brewer on the podcast. Dr. Brewer is a New York Times bestselling author, addiction psychiatrist, and neuroscientist. He's an associate professor and the director of research and innovation at the Center for Mindfulness at Brown University and the executive medical director of behavioral health at Sharecare Inc. He has developed clinically proven app-based mindfulness trainings, including those to help people with quitting smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. He's the author of The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits, and more recently, the book Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. Jud, so great to chat with you today on the podcast.
It's so great to be here.
This is a topic that's just a little bit timely. So, I think that there's very few topics that are more important than this one. But I'd like to start with tracing the development of your own career, because you're a psychiatrist, but I think you said you never planned on becoming a psychiatrist. Is that right?
That is true. I did this MD PhD program where you do a couple of years of medical school and then you do your PhD for long enough that you forget everything you learned in medical school, and then you go back into the wards and have to kind of catch up. So I actually did psychiatry as my first rotation back on the wards, thinking that, I'm never going to become a psychiatrist. And, here I am. It turned out to be really good, much better than expected.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Something I thought was really cool was this connection you made in your work between the mindfulness work that you were practicing on your own and the addiction work that you're learning as a psychiatry student, and that feeling of craving and clinging and grasping that a lot of people who are addicted to things mention. I thought there was a really brilliant connection, and you thought it was a valuable connection too, right?
I did. It was really interesting to see. I'd been training for about 10 years in mindfulness and was seeing these terms come up over and over around craving and clinging. And then when I started working with patients, especially in my psychiatry residency, they were using the same terms. And I was thinking, this cannot be a coincidence. And so I really looked into it a lot more to see, a very, very deep connection.
Yeah. Why did you start meditating? Was there a particular reason?
Well, I was stressed, beginning of medical school.
Good reason. Yeah. And around that time, what was the science of meditation showing? So around what year was that, if I may ask?
Yeah, I started medical school in 1996. And back then, there were probably literally a handful of papers that had been published on the science of mindfulness. I think Jon Kabat-Zinn had started his mindfulness-based stress reduction program in the 70s. He started publishing a couple of papers in the early 80s. But there was really a long drought between literally just 2 or 3 papers being published to until probably the mid-2000s. And then the field really just started exploding.
Yeah. And you've contributed quite a bit to it.
I've tried to do my piece here and there.
You sure have. You've done more than a little. Yeah, so I really like this phrase you said in your book. I try to science the shit out of anxiety. And that was a reference to the movie, right, that Matt Dillon was in? Matt Damon.
The Martian, yes, where he gets stranded on Mars and then he's got quite a quandary. And instead of, getting anxious, he turns that energy into good use to help him get off the planet.
Good. Well, let's use your powers to good use to help all of us unwind today, because I know that we're all stressed.
Sounds great.
I'm just gonna speak for everyone. How's that?
And I think you would be speaking pretty adequately. We've seen a rise of anxiety over the last 4 or 5 years, but there was a huge spike in the year 2020. Yeah,
for sure. So how can we work with our anxiety and break these unhelpful habits and addictions?
Well, the way I think of this is, and I see this a lot in my clinic, is that a lot of us really don't know how our minds work. And I can certainly speak for myself. I didn't know how my mind worked. Even learning a bunch of medical school stuff didn't really give me a good handle on how my mind worked. So here, I think it's really helpful to start with just really understanding, our minds, and not, every single neuron and every single brain region, but really understanding some of the most essential basics, like how habits form and why we form habits, and how some of those habits can spin out of control and start, move from helping us survive to actually being anti-survival when we really get caught up in anxiety. So that's the place that I start.
That's a good starting place. You have this phrase in your book, everyday addictions. I think there's quite a bit of controversy in the field about what actually counts as an addiction and what doesn't count as an addiction. Like, what is an everyday addiction and what are the features of that?
Well, I think of this as related to a definition of addiction that I learned back in residency, which was, an addiction is continued use despite adverse consequences. And that's basically the definition that the American Society of Addiction Medicine uses now. And it's one that I've used throughout my clinical practice because it's very pragmatic. It doesn't label people as, oh, you use cocaine or you use heroin or you smoke cigarettes. It's, is what you're doing causing problems? And that, of course, covers the classic addictions, but it also helps us see things that we might not have noticed otherwise that are causing us problems. So, for example, when people text when they drive, it's been shown that texting is more dangerous than drunk driving. So there's an example of continued use despite adverse consequences. When somebody can't wait to check their phone when somebody has texted them while they're driving, that's a problem, And so there's, it can fall into this realm of addiction where we're so addicted to our phones, for example, or social media or checking our news. It's really causing adverse consequences, whether it's personally or professionally, or even, rifts or breakdowns in our relationships and our family.
Wow. Can all addictions be reversed? Like, are there any addictions or any things? Like, how do you know when you've passed the point of no return? I'm obsessed with that question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I have yet to find an addiction that cannot be reversed. And
wow.
Yeah, so it's good news because, if we can form them, we can unform them.
Well, that's amazing. And sometimes it might just take as long as it took to form them.
It might. Yeah, and it doesn't have to. So this is one of the beautiful things about our brains. There's so many beautiful aspects of the brain. But one of them is that our brain has to adapt very quickly to rapidly changing circumstances. Otherwise, we won't survive. If you think of our ancient ancestors, they couldn't afford to be chased by the saber-toothed tiger 20 times before they realized that was dangerous. They had to adapt pretty quickly. And so here, even if we form a longstanding habit or addiction, we can actually unlearn it relatively quickly if we really tap into our brains. Just as an example, I work with a lot of folks that try to quit smoking. And I've had people that have been smoking or dipping for, decades. And they, within months, they're able to quit that addiction. And this is despite having reinforced those habit loops. One guy, I actually calculated it with one patient. He'd reinforced this habit loop with smoking 293,000 times over his 40-year smoking career. Yeah, can you imagine that? 300,000 times. Yeah.
This is giving hope.
Yes, there is hope. We're not all doomed. It's really about understanding.
We're not all doomed. Only some of us are.
Only some of us, yes.
Well, because I can't stop picking my nails. It's like a lifelong thing.
So, let's zoom in there because, this adverse consequences piece is a really critical element for changing any habit. So it's got to be causing us enough pain, let's say, for us to want to quit. The classic addiction, somebody hits rock bottom before they actually are motivated to change the behavior. But for example, my guess is that picking your nails isn't going to get you fired from a job or, ruin a relationship or something like that. It's just kind of annoying, perhaps. Am I on track there?
Yeah, it hasn't been a deal breaker on any dates yet. But if it did become a deal breaker, then I would quit immediately.
Yeah, excellent. So there's a great example. Adverse consequences gets us to change behavior. But the nice thing there is we don't have to actually hit rock bottom on everything. We can kind of dial in and bring awareness in and help ourselves see very clearly in the moment when we're doing something that it's not that helpful, that actually can help us break those habits without having to go to those extremes.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to announce that the 8-week online Transcend course is back. This iteration of the course, which will run from September 5th to October 24th of this year, will use science to help you live a more fulfilling, meaningful, creative, and self-actualized life. There will be limited slots available, so save your spot as soon as possible. In addition to the regular class pricing, we're also offering limited slots for personal self-actualization coaching. Save your spot today by going to transcendcourse.com. That's transcendcourse.com. The Transcend course is just one of the offerings of the brand new Center for the Science of Human Potential. The Center for the Science of Human Potential's mission is to use science to help each person fulfill their highest potential and contribute to the good of society. Toward that goal, we offer classes, coaching, and consulting opportunities to help people apply the latest science to help themselves, their organizations, their schools, their families, and their communities to be more creative, loving, and full of transcendent possibilities. For more on the center, you can go to scienceofhumanpotential.com. Hey everyone, doing this podcast for y'all is one of my greatest privileges, but the costs of maintaining a professional production like this one really adds up. I'm grateful to today's sponsors who help fund the show, but if you'd prefer a completely ad-free experience, you can join us at patreon.com/psychpodcast. You'll get completely ad-free episodes, all while directly supporting the show for as little as $5 a month. That's patreon.com/psychpodcast. Okay, so why do we prefer cake to broccoli? Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this actually forms a whole section of my book because this is one of the most critical elements. This is like the element of neuroscience. If anybody were to pay attention, it'd be to this piece. And so just a tiny bit of background here. I've been studying habit change for a long time. And one of probably the most predominant tactic or approach that people take to habit change is willpower. Just eat salad instead of cake or whatever. Yet, as we see with the diet industry, for example, obesity rates have been going up despite us knowing this formula for decades, despite, programs like Weight Watchers being around forever. So, there's something that we're missing there. And what we're missing is that that's not actually how our brains work. Willpower is more myth than muscle, and at best, it gets depleted throughout the day, though those data are controversial. But let's just say at best, willpower is a limited resource. I think most folks could agree with that. So here, it's really about looking at how our brains actually form habits, and then taking that and saying, okay, can we turn it on its head? Can we actually change habits using that very, very powerful part of the brain? And that's really why I wrote that whole section around why we prefer cake to broccoli. Our brain, there's a part of our brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that actually forms and stores reward value. So you can think of it as making a list of the most rewarding things in our lives and the least rewarding things. Most rewarding at the top, least rewarding at the bottom. And what it does is it uses that list to make quick decisions. So, we don't have to go in, if we're given a choice between, say, cake and broccoli, when we've learned the reward value of broccoli and when we've learned the reward value of cake, it kind of stores those and then it can recall that reward value quickly. And instead of having to eat some of each one and decide which one we want, our brain just, launches for the cake because it tastes better. From a survival standpoint, that's all about calorie density. Cake is much more calorie dense. So we prefer cake to broccoli from a neuroscientific standpoint because it has more calories. From a hedonic standpoint, it just tastes better. And that better taste is what alerts us to pick that behavior in the future when given a choice. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me.
Excellent.
But no, I hope that makes sense to people because, people distinguish between the wanting and liking system of dopamine. And it's really important to unpack the difference between wanting and liking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we can take a moment to geek out on that, the pleasant taste of cake actually alerts our brain. So the first time we eat cake, it could be when we're a kid at a birthday party or whatever. First time we eat that cake, there's a surprise because our brain says, "Ooh, that looks interesting," and we try it, and our brain says, "Ooh, that's pretty good," and we fire dopamine which lays down that memory that says, "Oh, cake tastes good. Remember that, and eat cake in the future." We also associate that taste with all the environmental cues, all the things around it, so the context. So if it's a birthday party, it's having fun, opening presents, probably eating some ice cream as well as cake and all of that. So we lay down this composite reward value, when we eat cake for the first time, then our brain starts shifting how it fires dopamine. It shifts away from when we actually do the behavior to anticipating doing the behavior. So the next time we go to a birthday party, we see the cake and our brain fires dopamine that says, ooh, cake, good, go eat it, right? And so it drives us to go do something. So it starts with this, the liking quality, which is probably more than just dopamine. That dopamine fires to lay down that memory that then drives us to want the cake in the future. And this is true for any habit. So if we form a positive association around drinking alcohol, same thing. If we form a positive association or even a negatively reinforced behavior around smoking, if we're stressed out and we smoke a cigarette and we learn, oh, when I smoke, I feel better, that also lays down that same type of habit loop. So that urge to go do the behavior is really dopamine driven.
Absolutely. That was a great description of it. So, okay, how can we learn and grow from this though? Like, how can we use our more evolved conscious control centers so that we're not being driven by these more subcortical structures that have learned things in the past? Is that a fair way to ask the question?
It's a fair way to ask the question, but I'm actually going to ask the question, is that actually the way that we can actually change behaviors?
All right.
Because
good.
Yeah, I'll suggest that there are a couple of elements here. One is that the more evolved centers are younger and they're weaker. So they are actually going to go offline when we get stressed or when we get anxious, for example. So it's harder to utilize those unless we're Mr. Spock, who doesn't have emotions. So unless we're Vulcan, our prefrontal cortex isn't quite evolved enough to be able to outcompete these more primitive centers. And in fact, this goes, I remember I wrote a little bit about this in my Unwinding Anxiety book. There's a relief on the Parthenon in Greece from like 450 AD or something, very, very old relief that depicts a horse and a rider. And the horse denotes the passions, these urges, these cravings. And the rider depicts our reason, our willpower. And the rider is trying to tame this horse, yet we all know what is stronger. So this debate has been raging literally for centuries, like how do we actually utilize willpower? And what neuroscience is suggesting is that might not be the best way to go. And the reason I say that is, besides the fact that this is the youngest and weakest part of our brain, if we want to change a behavior, what is now pretty clear is that the only way to change a habit, for example, is to update the reward value or to change the reward value in our orbitofrontal cortex. And this has been shown since the 1970s. There are these two researchers, Rescorla and Wagner, who now have this famous reinforcement learning or reward value curve called the Rescorla-Wagner model, which basically says you're going to keep doing a behavior, especially if it's habitual, if you don't update the reward value. And if you bring awareness into the equation, and this is what I love about the interplay between Buddhist psychology and modern day psychology and even modern day neuroscience, is that there's what Rescorla and Wagner pointed out was that there was this error term that they called either a positive or a negative prediction error, meaning that if we don't pay attention and there's a behavior, eat the cake, we see the cake, we eat the cake, and we're not paying attention, that reward value is going to stay the same, and we're just going to keep that same reward value in our brain. If we pay attention when we eat the cake, let's say it's we've gone to a new bakery or something, and we eat a new chocolate cake, so we're really paying attention. We're like, ooh, what's this like? And it's the best chocolate cake that we've ever had. Our brain goes, oh, wow, that was really good. That gives our brain what's called a positive prediction error, and it says, ooh, cake from this bakery is killer. You got to go back there. So we lay down this memory that says, ooh, that's really good cake at that bakery. Or if we eat the cake at the bakery and it's not that good, our brain says it gets a negative prediction error. It's expecting it to be good, especially if it looks like other cake that we've had before. And it's lower. Our brain says, meh, not that great. We get this negative prediction error. And then we're less likely to go back and eat cake from that bakery. That's the only way that we can update reward value and change habits is through that. Notice how no willpower is involved there. Only awareness is needed for that. And so we can actually capitalize on this by really bringing in the essential elements. So if we want to change a habit, So ironically, what I do with my patients who want to quit smoking and they come in and, they want to quit smoking, I tell them to smoke. and they look at me like I'm crazy because they're like, Doc, I want to quit smoking. Why are you telling me to smoke? And I say, pay attention when you smoke. And maybe I'll explain a little of the neuroscience, maybe not, just to help them really get a sense for why they're doing this. But nobody has ever come back to my office and said, Doc, thank you so much. I never realized how good a cigarette tastes. They always come back and they're like, wow, I never realized that cigarettes taste like shit. How did I not notice that before? And I'm thinking, well, it's because it's a habit. You're not paying attention. But as they realize that, they get a negative prediction error, and that helps them become disenchanted with the behavior. So they naturally start to move in the direction of quitting. And in fact, my lab just finished a study. We did this with overeating. So we have this Eat Right Now app that we were studying, and we built in this function to have people, walk people through a mindfulness exercise as they were overeating. And it took as few as 10 or 15 times of people paying attention for that reward value to drop below zero. We could calculate this all out using these models. It dropped below zero where they flipped their behavior from overeating to not overeating. So this goes back to, it can take years to break a bad habit. No, it can actually happen pretty quickly if we're really, really paying attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it requires a certain sense of discipline as well. I mean, are there individual differences in discipline itself required to do that?
I think certainly there are individual differences in discipline, yet we all have the same capacity to be aware. And so talking about discipline, I would say, if somebody is interested enough, so there's a level, interest will drive discipline. If we're really interested in doing something, we're going to be disciplined to do it. If we're really interested in changing a behavior, that interest is going to drive discipline in any and all of us. If we're not that interested, so for example, let's go back, you used the example earlier of like picking nails, if we're not that interested because we're not that, it's not that painful for us, it's going to be hard to change that behavior, whether it's picking our nails or overeating or smoking or using opioids. It really spans the entire range there.
How do like different mindfulness personality types come into play here? Because I want to get to the individual differences level a bit.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question that we asked probably about 10 years ago now, where I had a friend, Jake Davis, who's a Pali scholar who really knows the ancient language in which the Buddhist teachings were written down. And there was this 5th century commentary called The Path of Purification, where I love that title, The Path of Purification.
Yeah.
And in that
doesn't sound fun.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It sounds like, this long, arduous process. But the idea there was, there was a section of that commentary in which different personality types were described. And those personality types line up very nicely with modern day, propensities to kind of approach, it's the fight, flight, freeze thing, where we've got these very basic instincts to, if there's danger, we're either going to fight or we're going to run away or we're going to freeze and, try to look like we're not there. And in fact, they really did a nice job of let's say, describing the tendencies that we all have, where some of us have more of a tendency to approach things. Some of us have more of a tendency to pull away, and some of us have more of a tendency to kind of freeze or do whatever everybody else is doing. So we did a study where we developed this, basically a personality questionnaire around these different, you can call them mindfulness personality types, let's say, just as an overarching thing. And, with 13 questions, basically anybody can kind of get a good sense of what their propensity is. And it's not that it's, sometimes it could be predominantly one, sometimes it could be a combination, just like any other personality type of thing. And with those, we can start to see where our strengths are and where our weaknesses are. So for example, folks that tend to be more likely to approach things, they're going to, with mindfulness practices, they're going to be more likely to easily practice things like loving kindness or these practices that have more of a positive feel to them. Whereas folks that are more of the avoid type, they tend to be more analytical, and they're going to benefit from doing practices, starting with practices that more fit with that personality type. So getting somebody started with the mindfulness practice, it can be helpful to know what that predominance is. So you can pick something that's easy for them to pick up, and they can get some quick wins and some immediate gains. And then over time, they know what's going to challenge them. So then they can start shifting into some of these other practices that might not be so easy for them to kind of challenge their skill set, so they can really, keep going at times when they've kind of mastered some of the earlier practices.
Cool. How can people take the test?
That is a great question. So we published this, I think, in PLOS One, which is an open access journal, several years ago. There's also a list of the questions and a scoring mechanism in my book, Unwinding Anxiety. And I think there's also an appendix in the Craving Mind in my first book, where people can also take the quiz.
Okay, so how do all this relate to anxiety? Because all this stuff is linked. Right. So, where does the anxiety part come into play when, because we've been talking a lot about addiction and being mindful and change and habit change. Where does anxiety come into play?
So this was a turn in the road for me that I had not actually noticed, which prompted several years of research and then writing this entire book, because I was so blown away by something that I had missed in medical school and in residency. So there's this medical term called number needed to treat. You're probably familiar with that, but for folks that aren't, it's basically a quick and dirty way of telling how well a treatment works. And basically the higher the number, the more people, the worse the treatment. So for example, with medications, when I prescribe gold standard medications for anxiety, the number needed to treat is 5.2, meaning that I have to treat just over 5 patients before one of them shows a significant benefit. So I was playing the medication lottery because I didn't know which one of the 5 people walked in my door. I didn't know which one was going to benefit on average. And the other part was, I didn't know what I was going to do with the other 80%, that weren't showing a significant benefit. So at the time that I was developing my own anxiety around helping my patients, I was studying this Eat Right Now app, and somebody in that program was saying, she said, I'm realizing that anxiety drives me to stress eat. Can you develop a program for anxiety? And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medications. I'm not, this isn't really my lane. But it put a bug in my ear. And so I went back and looked at the research literature to see if there was something that I slept through a class in medical school or residency or something like that. And back in the 80s, so this is when benzos were being prescribed like candy. Do you remember the Stones song, Mother's Little Helper, right? That's about benzos. She goes running to the shelter of Mother's Little Helper. So benzos are being prescribed like candy. They're no longer first-line treatment for anxiety in modern day. A lot of problems there. And the SSRIs were first starting to be developed. I think Prozac, the first one, was on the market around mid-'80s. So people were really focusing on medication, yet they were ignoring a literature that was starting to blossom. Thomas Borkovec at Penn State and others were suggesting that anxiety could be driven like any other habit through the mental behavior of worry. And when I read this, I had this light bulb moment. I was thinking, wow, I never realized that anxiety could be driven this way, and I know something about habits. So I put the two together and I said, well, let's develop, a habit-driven program in terms of helping people approach anxiety from a habit perspective. So we developed this Unwinding Anxiety app. And of course, as a clinician, I wanted to see how we could help people. As a researcher, I wanted to see if this thing actually worked, because, this was an old literature, it wasn't really, people weren't really talking about it that much in modern day. So I wasn't sure if it was just, overlooked or it just, hadn't panned out. So we did some clinical studies. We developed this Unwinding Anxiety app. We did a study with anxious physicians, right? For this, we got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety score. So that was pretty good. I was like, wow, that's pretty good. We did
amazing.
Yeah. And so we followed that with a randomized controlled trial of people with generalized anxiety disorder. Okay. You ready for this? We got a 67% reduction in anxiety scores. And here we could calculate the number needed to treat. So if you remember, for medications, that number is 5.2. So I have to treat 5 patients before one person benefits. With this Unwinding Anxiety app, that number needed to treat was 1.6.
What does it mean to be half of a person that you're treating? I'm joking. Or 2/3.
That's right. I try to treat the whole person, but yes, these are statistics. These are numbers.
Well, that's really amazing effect size. Wow. Now, is this an app that people listening today can download and can use?
Yes, anybody can download this from the App Store, Google Play, or the App Store on their iPhone.
I'm just going to do that right now. Forget the rest of this interview. I need this. Wow, that's a truly amazing effect. What do you think was the underlying causal mechanism there that played the biggest role in such a large effect?
Well, funny that you ask, because we got these nice clinical results, but of course I wanted to know what was happening mechanistically. So we could actually look at that, and we found that, so we had measured a number of things like increases in mindfulness, and in particular looking at emotional reactivity. So the theory is that with mindfulness, people will become less reactive to their emotions. So if they're anxious, they'll be less likely to just jump in and worry. So that was one aspect that we looked at. We also looked at worry itself, because worry is a core component of anxiety. It's even baked into the definition, and is a big element that's measured whether you look at generalized anxiety or other types of anxiety. So we looked at worry, and then of course we looked at these clinically validated anxiety scores. We used the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7 measure, which is one that I use in the clinic. And we found that mindfulness training specifically increased non-reactivity, and that non-reactivity mediated a decrease in worry, and that decrease in worry mediated a decrease in anxiety. So, and I should also back up and mention, we were specifically training people to map out these anxiety worry habit loops. So anxiety, so you need three elements for any habit: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. So anxiety was the trigger, worry was that mental behavior, and then the result, what they started to pay attention to, was seeing that the result of worry was that it wasn't actually that rewarding. Now, often we'll lay down the habit of worrying because it feels like we're in control, or it's distracting us a little bit from the worst feeling of anxiety. But in fact, when we have people pay attention and they realize they're not really in control of whatever they're worrying about, and that that worry feeds back and drives more anxiety. So anxiety triggers worry, worry feeds back and drives more anxiety, and then people get into this vicious loop of anxiety, worry. They realize that it wasn't that rewarding. If you go back to these Rescorla-Wagner models, it helps people see, worrying's not actually making me feel better, it's making me feel worse, so that they can then not learn to become less reactive to the anxiety, learn to be with those physical sensations, and have that not trigger worry. So that's mechanistically what we were finding. They're less reactive, they worry less, and that led to a big reduction in anxiety.
Wow, that's huge. That's so huge. So tell the people the name of the app again. Is it just called Unwinding Anxiety?
It's called Unwinding Anxiety, yes.
I'm sure everyone's going to their app store right now. This is huge. How much does it cost?
I don't remember. I don't pay attention that much. It's probably, I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Okay.
So people have to
under $1 million.
It's certainly that. Yeah. And I think they were trying to price it around the cost of a copay for somebody to see their primary care physician, once a month or something like that. So I think that they're trying to make it reasonable.
Great. Okay. So what's good about rainy days?
Yeah, that's a kind of a chapter title that I used because there's this this mindfulness practice that we've been studying a lot in my lab called RAIN. And the idea behind that is that, we can use, so the acronym RAIN stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and note. And the way
is that
it works,
your model?
No, it's built off
Tara
of
Brach's?
Well, Tara has popularized it. When I traced it back, Michelle McDonald was the one that first put this forward. And
Wow.
Tara really did a great job of popularizing it, has used it beautifully in her writings and her teachings. And it's interesting, she when I first learned it, that N stood for non-identification, which is a little conceptual for my clinic patients, some of them. And so we actually adapted that to a note, where there's this Burmese practice of kind of noting experience moment to moment. And I found that I started testing this in my VA when I was at the VA hospital, testing it with my outpatient clinics, and found that was very accessible. Somebody could note, whether it was seeing, feeling, hearing, tasting, or whatever the fifth sense is that I'm missing. They could basically note any of their senses plus thinking. And that noting practice helped them not be as caught up in whatever the thought or the emotion or the feeling was. So we started testing this first with our smoking program. So we have this app called Craving to Quit. So we started developing it and testing it there, used it also for helping people with overeating, when they had an urge to eat. And then also people can use this with anxiety. So if let's use the eating example, because we've been talking about cake a lot. If somebody has an urge to eat some cake, that R comes in, if they want to use this practice, they can recognize, oh, I've got a craving, right? Because if we don't recognize that we have a craving, we're just going to be lost. We're going to be on autopilot. We're just going to eat it. So we first have to recognize what's happening. That A stands for allow. So often when we have a craving, we'll try to resist it. We'll think, oh, bad craving. I need to make that go away so I don't eat the cake. Well, we can only resist for so long. And you probably know the saying, what we resist persists. So, these things tend to get stronger. Cravings tend to get stronger if we resist them. So instead of resisting, we invite them in and say, okay, here's a craving, come on in. Let's see what you're all about. And that let's see what you're all about is what that I stands for, where we investigate what's happening in our experience. And I love this, basically it's about being curious about what's happening. And one thing that's beautiful about that is curiosity. If you compare a craving to curiosity feels much better than a craving. So in that moment where we've got this unpleasant urge to eat the cake, we can bring in curiosity and go, oh, what does this urge feel like? And we kind of break it down into its component elements, where this is where the noting comes in. We can note, okay, what does craving feel like? Well, it's tightness, it's heat, it's restlessness. Okay, now it is, it's this, now it's that. And from moment to moment, we can start to dissect it into its component elements, where we can see, oh, instead of this being some big, bad, scary craving that feels like, my head's going to explode. I actually had a patient walk into my office saying his head was going to explode if he didn't smoke. That's how scary it can be. Instead of that, we can break it down and say, okay, well, how scary is tightness? Well, it's just tightness. It's not that scary. How scary is heat? Well, it's just kind of heat. How scary is burning? How scary is restlessness? And these things themselves are not that scary. Also, as we note from moment to moment, we see that these experiences, they might get a little more intense, but then they eventually fade. And we can see, I don't have to actually act on this craving. I don't have to eat the cake. I don't have to smoke the cigarette. I don't have to do whatever. If I just bring curiosity in, it helped me ride that wave out. So the RAIN practice helps anybody that's got an urge to do something, if it's a craving for cake or a cigarette or whatever, to really help them be in the moment and start to break that link between urge and action. And in fact, of course, my lab does studies, so we did a study on this, and we found that after 4 weeks of mindfulness training, smokers in particular could completely break that link between that urge, that craving to smoke, and the smoking itself.
This is incredible. But there's so many complexities when we talk about humans, because we have first order desires, then we have second order desires, then we have third order desires. I'm still not sure I fully understand who the real me is. Like how do I I mean, I've argued that there is no real me, and there's no such thing as real me when we talk about authenticity. I mean, we have so many like evolutionary modules that are pulling us in so many different directions based on environmental stimuli and triggers and things, and internal things going on as well. But, we might have an urge to do something, but then we have the urge that says, I don't want to want that urge. What if, I mean, sometimes someone can have urges to do things that are, in moderation are just fine. Is the problem when it gets out of control, when it kind of like overtakes the whole system? Is that the problem?
Yes. And that's one of the beautiful aspects of our brains is that, if you go back to this definition of addiction, continued use despite adverse consequences. So if we bring awareness in and we start to see a habit loop, say around eating, and we bring awareness in and we really pay attention as we eat, it's not that suddenly we're going to magically not like cake. That's not how our brains work. But what we can do is see when we're over consuming, we can start to see where that pleasure plateaus. And that naturally helps us start to moderate behavior when previously we would just overeat and not pay attention. And so, I even have some of folks in our programs or my patients in my clinic, I have them pay attention with each bite and say, just ask, is this better than, same as, or worse than the last bite? So they can kind of map out that pleasure plateau in their experience right in that moment. And that also helps them bring curiosity in. Is this as good as? Is it better than? Is it worse than the last one? And it helps them start to see, it's plateauing. It's really not that great. Oh, it's actually worse than than that last bite. Now's a good time to stop. So with things like eating food, awareness itself helps us moderate our behavior, where we don't have to, we don't have to go all psychological on ourselves too much. If we're really just focused on that awareness of that behavior in that moment.
Wow, this is so useful and practical information for people and hopeful. What is anxiety sobriety?
Well, here, I like that term because I was
Me too.
So this came to me when I was with anybody using our apps can join a live group. We run a Zoom group on Wednesdays at noon Eastern. So anybody can join that group and ask questions, basically, where we can help clarify concepts, help people work through struggles, things like that. And there was a guy on there that joined us one day that said to me, he said, I feel pretty anxious. How can I work with my anxiety? And I said, well, what tools of the program have you been using and how well have they worked? And he said, I think he was using RAIN, or he was using some of the tools. And he said, in the moment, I actually notice how calm I can feel when I'm mindful. But I get I might get really anxious later. And so, he kept coming in with this but. And he was always spinning out into the future, which is, anxiety is basically fear of the future. That's a big piece here. And so it occurred to me that he was describing something that a lot of my patients with addiction struggle with, which is, I have a patient who's got alcohol use disorder, and they say, I don't know if I can be sober in a week. And I really don't know if I can be sober in a month. What I have them do is I have them dial it back. And I say, okay, if you're not sure you can be sober in a week, how about can you know if you can be sober tomorrow? And they say, well, I don't know. A lot of things could happen between today and tomorrow. And so we dial it back and we say, well, how about, if I'm meeting with them in the morning, how about noon today? Can you be sober for the next couple of hours? And that actually kind of brings their future into more focus because it's more immediate. And they're like, well, I could probably be sober, for 2 more hours. And then I say, let's dial it back right now. Are you sober right now? And they say, yeah, well, I'm sitting in your office. Not everybody's always, but in general, folks come to my office sober. And so it's like, okay, take it one moment at a time, right? So with AA, they talk about one day at a time. If you think too far into the future, you're going to run into trouble because our brains are not good at predicting the future, especially if a lot of things can happen between now and tomorrow or next week or next month. So this anxiety sobriety term came to mind when I was talking to this guy, and I was thinking, oh, this sounds a lot like what my patients struggle with addictions. He was struggling with thinking way too far into the future. And so what I had him do, we kind of worked through this in real time. I said, okay, well, if you're not sure if you can not be anxious tomorrow, can you dial it back to 2 hours? Can you dial it back to 1 hour? And we dialed it back to right now. And I said, well, how do you feel right now? He's like, well, I feel relatively calm. And I said, well, in the next 5 minutes, if you feel anxious, can you bring in your mindfulness tools? And he said, yeah, I can do that. And I said, okay, take it 5 minutes at a time. And so in this way, we all can develop our anxiety sobriety by, one, noticing when our mind is spinning out into the future, worrying about, I don't know if I'll be anxious tomorrow. And then two, dialing it back and taking it 1 day or 1 hour or 1 moment at a time. Because in this moment, we can actually work with what's happening and work with our anxiety.
This is groundbreaking. How does this relate to suicidal thoughts?
Great question. So, people can have suicidal thoughts for based on a number of different things. So when I have a patient who might, be having some suicidal thoughts, one thing I work with them with is to help them identify those, as the thoughts that they're having, the emotions that they're having, and even bring it into very concrete terms, like what is it that's driving the thought? For some people, suicidal thoughts can actually be can be driven in the same manner as other habits or addictions, where there's some type of reward that their brain's getting from having that thought, and on a very basic level, think of a trigger behavior result pathway. If somebody's really stressed out or really has a lot of existential angst or is feeling really depressed, that feeling, that negative emotion can drive them to have a thought about, boy, it would be better if I just weren't around, And that thought can give them this, this where they can project into the future and like they get this reward, like, oh yeah, it'd be better if I weren't around. So they have this thought, oh yeah, it'd be, it just feels better in that moment. And then that drives back and feeds, the next time they have that really negative emotion, their brain's more likely to have that suicidal thought. So here we can even start to map out this process itself with anything, whether it's a suicidal thought or or a cigarette or anything. That there's a shared mechanism there in the brain. Yeah,
and then after 6 years and 5 minutes of anxiety sobriety, well, then what?
Then we take it that next moment.
Why do you label? Tell me about the significance of 6 years and 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. So at the very end of my book, I wrote about. So I had when we first developed our first digital therapeutic, this first app for smoking, the Craving to Quit app. I was down. I think I was giving a TEDx talk down in Virginia, somewhere near DC, and there was a talk on flow. And since I was in DC, I figured I had a friend, Tim Ryan, who's a congressman from Ohio, and I said, oh, I'll look him up and see if we can get together. And so I stopped by his office and I said, hey, we just developed this app for smoking, and he's very interested in mindfulness related things. And he said, oh, that's interesting, tell me about it. And I was telling him about it, and he got this glint in his eye, and there was this, he suddenly calls out to one of his young aides, and he goes, hey, you, get in here. And he goes, you smoke, don't you? And the poor kid, scared to death, what's he going to make me do now? And Congressman Ryan goes, hey, you don't have to quit smoking, but just try this app and tell me if it's any good. And so, this kid downloads the app, so he starts trying it out. And in fact, I think he wrote me an email saying, this is a couple of weeks later, he said, I wasn't actually interested in quitting, but I tried it and I actually quit smoking. I was never expecting to do that.
Wow.
So the 6 years later thing is Tim and I were giving talks at a conference 6 years later. And he was sitting next to me right before I went up to give my talk. And he leans over and whispers in my ear and he goes, hey, you remember this guy? And I go, yeah, of course. And he goes, he's still smoke free. And I just, I just got these tears in my eyes. I was like, wow, that's amazing. So 6 years later, this guy, was just trying this app out because Congressman Ryan was asking him to. And he learned, basically these basic mindfulness skills that helped literally, prevent, smoking is one of the leading causes of morbidity and mortality in the US. And so he had helped himself in a way that, his body was going to thank him for the rest of his life. And so it was just really nice to see that, 6 years later, it still had taken.
Wow. I can't wait to try this app. and maybe it can help me stop picking my nails.
Funny you mention that, because folks have used our smoking app for everything from internet porn to trichotillomania, like hair pulling, to skin picking, because the skills are the same. It's just what you apply it to. So let me know. Let me know what you find.
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Brewer, just thank you so much for coming on the show today and dropping your wisdom. It's so important during this time. And like I said at the beginning of this chat, I can't think of too many topics that are more important than this right now. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Also, if you'd prefer a completely ad-free experience and would like early access to new episodes, you can join us at patreon.com/psychpodcast. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.